What's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and in this episode of Coding with the Fours, we're going to go over exception handling in both Apex and in Lightning Web Components. Alright guys, so today we are going to go over exceptions in both Apex and in Lightning Web Components. We're going to figure out what they are, why they matter, and we're going to build some examples together and create custom exception types together as well. So hopefully by the end of this you know just about everything you need to know about exceptions to be able to use them in practice, right? So before we get started, if you enjoyed this video by the end of it, please make sure to actually hit the like button, because that helps me get this video out to more people just like yourself that are interested in learning this stuff too. And if you really like this content and you want to see more of it, make sure to subscribe, because not only will you get to see more videos as soon as they're posted, but you get entered into a free drawing where I fund Salesforce certifications for you. So definitely hit subscribe if you like it, and hey, maybe you'll get lucky and win a free cert. Who knows? I just randomly select them. So anyway, now that that's over, let's get back to exceptions. You might be wondering, what is an exception? Or even if you're not wondering that, you're probably wondering, why would I care to handle exceptions in my code? And that's a great question. Basically, exceptions are failures that occur within your code, right? So I think you've all seen things like null pointer exceptions. If you haven't, you're going to find that one pretty quick. DML exceptions, things along those lines. There's a long list of exceptions that I've got right here in front of me, and chances are very high that if you've been developing on this system, or really any system, for more than, maybe a month, you've run into one of these. At the very least, you've probably run into DML exceptions. And it's beneficial to, catch these in your code when they happen, because otherwise you end up with something ugly that a user gets to see, like this. And nobody wants to see this. Execution of before update caused blah, 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 blah. That's horrible, right? That's a horrible experience for an end user. Whereas if we'd have just done exception handling here, we could generate something more along the lines of the following. Once my code saves and I switch this up, you can give them an error that is a lot more tailored to the situation. And then they can come back to you as the developer and tell you exactly what went wrong, and it saves everybody time. On top of that, it's a better user experience, and if you're handling your exceptions, chances are you can make yourself an error log and get way ahead of the game before the, and help yourself out whenever the user reports this error to you. So there are numerous benefits to exception handling, and you should not overlook it. It's not necessarily the funnest thing to do in your code, but it is something that's super important if you want to maintain a good overall user experience, and you want to make it easier on yourself as a developer when these errors come in and you have to deal with them and, fix your code so that users don't experience them again, right? Ideally. So, all right. We've covered the what an exception is. And we've covered why it might be important. Another example of why it might be important is if you have a Lightning Web Component or a custom UI, right, that you've built, and you are clicking something and it just doesn't generate what people expected. If you don't have error handling here, then the user's just going to be lost a lot of the time. Sometimes it'll give you one of those ugly errors that we just talked about, but a lot of the times it'll just not do its job randomly, and your component will just cease to do what you expected it to do, and the user will be extremely lost and confused, and that's just bad overall. Whereas if, yet again, if we actually handled these errors, then we'd have a different experience that was a little easier for end users and for developers. So let's take a look at one that generates something, an error here. Now we've got an error at least that the user is able to see and report, and it makes it easier yet again for the developers to deal with things. So now I think we've gone over at least a couple examples to help you visualize why exception handling is so important. Let's get into some of the code and build some of this stuff out together so that you can see just how simple it is, and you know, maybe you can start using it today or tomorrow or at least this week. Who knows? So first things first, let's go over how to deal with this trigger error handling scenario where we save it and we get this much nicer error message than the one that we had before. Yeah, so let's pull up Illuminated Cloud, or really IntelliJ with the Illuminated Cloud 2 plugin. Just like I say at the beginning of every video that I do, if you have no idea what this is IntelliJ and Illuminated Cloud 2. It's an IDE. If you have never used it before and don't know what's going on, don't worry. I've got a video. It's 18 minutes long. You watch it. It'll save you so much of your time. This is my favorite IDE for Salesforce. And if you have no idea what an IDE is, or you'd prefer to use Visual Studio Code, I've got videos for those too. So there'll be a playlist in the description. You can check it out. There'll probably be a link up above too. And you'll know everything you need to know about IDEs, and it will save you literally hundreds, if not thousands, or tens of thousands of hours over the course of your career. So definitely check it out. Worth the 18 minutes of time. All right. So I'm over here and I'm in my account trigger handler, my account trigger handler. Really, I would refer to this as the domain class. I know that's a little bit foreign for a lot of people. If you have no idea what a domain class is and you're interested, I do also have a video for that one, and I'll put it in the description and up above as well. But you don't really need to know what it is for the purposes of this video. So if you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. Just imagine we're in an account trigger handler, because for all you need to know right now, that's basically what we're doing. In the account trigger handler, for the example that I set up, basically I had two methods. One where I just set an account ID to high, which is obviously an illegal thing to do. I cannot set this ID to high. It's just, it will never allow you to do this. And I don't do anything, right? I don't handle this scenario. If anything goes wrong when I change this ID, it's just gonna, you know, throw an exception, and I'm not gonna handle it in any way, right? There's nothing that, you know, I'm not gonna be able to present the end user with anything. I'm not gonna be able to correct the error on my own if I find it, any of that stuff. Alternatively, down here, I've got another method where I do catch the exception. So basically what's happening right here is we've got a try catch block. And this is what you're going to use for exception handling, to basically catch, you know, edge case scenarios, handle them, and either present the end user with a better looking error, or create an error log, or fix the, you know, transgression on your own, or whatever else, right? So so what we have right here is a try. And what this means when I do this try catch block here is I am trying to assign this ID to the value high, right? I could be doing 20 other things in here. There could be 50 other lines of code in here. Ideally, you don't do that, but you could. You could have a bunch of lines of code in here, and you could try all of that code. And if anything went wrong with that code, you could catch it. Now, you shouldn't do that, and I'll explain why in just a bit. But just for the sake of understanding how this try-catch block works, I just wanted to point that out. And then if anything goes wrong within this try block here, we're going to catch it. And in our case, we're catching it and using the method add error that you can use within triggers to present an error to the user that's a little more meaningful and useful to not only the user, but the person who's going to have to come deal with the error later. So This is not what you have to do in a catch block. You could do anything in this catch block when you're catching your exceptions. And you could, you could do things like fix the problem on your own. So if you had a problem with that, you could say, okay, the ID is equal to something legal, right? I don't know what that is, but and you really can't set IDs in your code anyway. So at least not this ID field. And you could do whatever you wanted in this catch block to handle it. And if you don't throw an error in here, your code is actually, so if I didn't throw this error, because I've caught this problem, my code would actually continue onward. So for instance, if I wanted to call another method after this was done, update account type, which is right below it, then I could, and it would operate because I've tried this, it failed, I caught the failure, and I tried to do something with it. Well, this would actually fail again, but just imagine I do nothing, I'm just catching it. Well, this would go onward, right? I've caught it, I've theoretically dealt with it, and it's moving. I wouldn't suggest handling it this way, but just for the sake of argument here, you could. I could go on to then say update the phone and set it equal to 888-888-8888. Right? I could do this, and so just to show you what I mean, I'm going to save this and we'll run it together over here, and I'm going to save this, and you'll see that the phone number should get updated, and we're not actually going to see this error pop up anymore. So we'll save it, and the phone number gets updated and the error doesn't happen, and that's because we've caught this, right? We tried it, we caught it, we did nothing when we caught it, and then we moved on. So just to understand a little bit better how try-catch blocks work, even though it entered this catch block, because I didn't actually add an error or stop anything or throw the error or inform the user that anything negative happened, which you should do, it's going to move on. If you're not fixing the problem on your own, you should present an error, but it will move on because you handled that exception in your own way, right? After the catch block, there's also another block that you can add called the finally block. And the finally block is basically going to run after all of this is done processing, right? So if we just did the try and the try was actually successful, then it would skip the catch, but still run this finally block. So if I always, for instance, no matter what happened, wanted to update the phone, then I could update the phone. And if I wanted this, to happen even after the catch occurred, all right, if I needed to make sure that happened, then I would, this would happen immediately after the catch was handled too, unless you throw an error, right? If I, for instance, had this error and I'm, actually adding it and throwing it there. Let me change this phone number. I'll change it to 555-222-2222 or something. If I save this, it's not actually going to update that phone number because I threw that add error there and it stopped it, right? That's going to actually halt my transaction. When you throw an error here within the catch, it's going to halt the transaction and not actually do this finally, right? But again, if I was not throwing an error, which occasionally is a good thing, but often maybe not so much, then it would hit this block. So just to prove this, just to show how this works yet again. Now I'm not doing anything in my catch block. I'm just trying this. It's failing. I'm not doing anything, but I am handling it technically. And then the finally is going to run. It's going to update my phone number again. So pretty important stuff to know. And one last thing you should know, one thing that people have probably been wondering while I've been doing this, if you have any exposure to exceptions and in any way at all, is, they've probably been thinking, why are you using the generic exception class, this thing here, right? If you didn't know, and if you're watching this video, it's very likely that you probably don't. There are, plenty of exception types that are more granular. They're more specific about the exception that you are catching and dealing with at that moment in time. You can, however, just use this generic exception to catch all of your exceptions, right? Any theoretical exception that came through, you might want to catch it. Now, as far as why you would choose to use the more granular exceptions as opposed to just using this catch-all exception class here, that is a good question. There's a couple reasons. Number one, say I used a DML exception here, right? DML exceptions are exceptions that happen whenever you're manipulating the database in any way. You're updating, you're querying, and something goes wrong, any of that kind of stuff, right? And those, you actually, if you can know, I guess, that you are actually catching a DML exception or an email exception, you get extra methods to find out more information about your failures, which is great, right? There's a lot more that you can do with this specific emailing type, or exception type, and you might want to get more granular here, make sure that you catch that specific one so that you can get more information about your exception that just got processed. Another thing is, very often you really only have maybe one exception type that could theoretically be thrown, or maybe you have 2 or 3 that could maybe be thrown. And in those edge case scenarios where, say, it through a DML exception, or potentially an email exception, or potentially say like an external objects exception, you might want to tailor your error messaging for those specific exceptions, right? So for a DML one, maybe you want to be more specific and say, this happened due to a DML error, blah, blah, blah. And for an external object one, you get more specific about the external object error and tailoring how it gets presented to your users. So when you get more specific here, you can get much more specific with your messaging back to your end user, right? That's really one of the biggest benefits, at least in my experience, of being more explicit in your exception types that you catch, right? If you have no need to get more explicit, as much as some people might tell me I'm terrible for saying this, if you have no reason to be explicit and you just need something so that it's at least a little prettier for your users, and you just need to get something out the door, which occasionally that's what happens, to be useful, then the generic exception is fine. But just so you know, that is the primary cases I've used this more granular exception types in. Okay, and just to be super clear what I mean here, I guess I haven't explained that you can, if you're trying to get these more granular scenarios, figured out or caught, I guess, you can have multiple catches, right? So if I want to do that external object exception, then I can do that, right? You can have a bunch of catches in one statement, but there is something important to note. Say, for instance, I caught exception up here. It's not gonna let me do these two below it if I try to save it, which I will here in a second. it's not going to let me do these two below it because it's going to say, hey, you're already catching these two scenarios here, right? So if I try this, it's going to fail here in maybe a second or two whenever it finishes deploying. There we go. And it's going to say the following, exception type was already caught, right? Because this generic one is catching those exceptions. So you can't catch the exceptions in the same exception in two different ways, but you can, list out your exceptions, exception type by exception type. And, maybe I was a little too specific in your scenarios. I mean, there might be situations where you want to throw an error, say the DML one, I want to throw an error, but say this external object one, I want to actually handle it and not produce anything for my users. That's another scenario where this comes in handy. Or say you have a call out exception, something along those lines, you're calling out to another system and it fails. Well, maybe you want to give an error to your users, or maybe you just want to retry that call out because of whatever happened. Maybe if you do enough integrations with things, you'll know that every once in a while the server will be down for like a quarter of a second in your attempt to reach out to it failed, but if you retry it, then you'll be good. So there's a bunch of different reasons why you want these more granular try catch blocks outside of just the errors as well. But yeah, there you go. I think I've gone over this quite a bit. There is one scenario that I want us to build together, though, so that you can see one somewhat frustrating and somewhat cool thing that Salesforce does for you, which is it handles some errors on its own, and you cannot get around it. So let's just quickly build this together. We'll say private void update account phone, and we'll pass in an account in here, and we'll say try account.phone equals I don't know, I'm just gonna do this a whole bunch so I hit the character limit there. And we'll just try and catch all the theoretical exceptions you could catch just to prove you can't catch this error. And we'll say account.add error phone value not cool, bruh. All right, and I'm going to just call that up here on the before update, and I'm going to comment out this one and save this, and then we'll go back over to our account page and see what happens. So maybe let's save this, and you're going to see that it's saying something different, right? It's throwing an error, and it's at least kind of nice for the user, kind of. It says accounts, data changed by trigger for the account phone field, or account field, for the field account phone, if I can read. Data value too large. Value has been hidden. Obviously, that's not what I wanted to add here. I wanted to say phone value not cool, bruh. But it didn't work out because Salesforce catches this and a handful of other errors like it on its own, and you have no ability to overwrite this. It's cool, and it's not so cool. I mean, it's nice that they deal with this sometimes, but it would be nice if I could tailor my own messaging, right? And I've had complaints about this before, but to my knowledge, there is no way around this. So a little frustrating, but there are some errors out there that there are exceptions out there that Salesforce handles on its own, and you cannot handle it. So yeah, there you go. A little bit of extra fun there. All right, so let's move on to Lightning. web components and see how we can handle errors within Lightning Web Components. So earlier, man, my dog is just not giving up on whatever it's barking at up there. Earlier, we were talking about this, or we were taking a look at this exception handling example Lightning Web Component that is very simple. Basically, it just generates this modal that either displays an error or I don't handle the error and it displays nothing, which is frustrating. So the question here and what we're going to take a look at with this Lightning Web Component is how can you best in Apex generate an exception that's easy for you to handle in your Lightning Web Component itself, right? Because believe it or not, unfortunately, it can be tricky if you don't use some of the things you're supposed to use for it, or you would ideally use for it anyway. So let's pull this up. So we've got our exception handling example here. It's pretty simple. I've got a button, and then I've got this little modal that renders itself and shows you this error message that we just saw just a second ago, which is just a variable in my JavaScript controller. So whenever we open the modal, right, whenever I press this button, it tries to open the modal. And that modal calls the method generate error exception handled, and it calls out to an Apex class up here called exception handling example. So let's take a look at the Apex class to see what we're doing in it. In the Apex class, we have this method called exception handled. And in the exception handled one, we're yet again using a try catch block to try and handle our exceptions when they occur. And you can see here that in this catch block, I am throwing a new aura handled exception. And then I'm kind of, giving it a string that I would like to send out and sending the message that is inside of this exception that got caught. Now, there are other ways to throw errors, right? I could just simply throw E here instead of this aura handled exception. If I do this, however, and I'm trying to present this error to users on the screen in my aura component or my Lightning Web component, unfortunately, this is not so great. As you can see here, I'm catching any errors, which I'll explain this piece a little more in just a minute. And then down here, I'm calling the handle errors, and I'm looking at the error body message. Now, I'll explain this more in detail in just a second. But if you don't throw an aura handled exception and you just throw whatever exception is there, unfortunately, this is not always what will occur. You won't get error.body.message. You have to dig a little deeper into the JSON object that gets returned to you, and it can vary from exception type to exception type where exactly you find your problem or you find what you want to find to display to your users, which can be pretty tricky. So whenever I'm doing this stuff with Lightning Web Components and I want to return an error or throw an exception, I always throw the aura handled exception and then just get the data out of the exception that I care about, whether that's the message or, if you didn't know, there's lots and lots of methods that you can utilize here. Whether I want to get the cause, I want to get the line number where the code failed, I want to get the stack trace. If I really want to return that to the user, I probably don't. I normally only do that for error logging or whatever else, right? I think that I want to be able to, I want to send back to my user for them to be able to see. I just pull that out of the exception itself and put it in this aura handled exception, because these aura handled exceptions are much, much easier to deal with here than just throwing either a custom exception or one of these exception types, the default exception types that are available to you out of the box. Okay, so we've got this aura this aura enabled method called exception handled. It's going to try to query for a contact that doesn't exist. So when it tries to give this a value, it's going to fail and give you that wonderful query has no values to assign to S object. Very common failure if you've done anything in Salesforce for too long. And then it's going to throw this new aura handled exception, right? Now, back here, where I am actually calling my Apex method called, I've imported it up here, import exception handled from Apex exception handling example, exception handled. Down here, I'm using that value, exception handled, and I'm saying, after I call it, in the event that an error occurs, this dot catch here, I'm going to run this method. So basically what you're going to want to do is use the catch to catch any errors that might occur, right? In the event that errors do occur, I want to catch them. And then what I do is I've got this error message variable up here, and in this handle errors method that I've created, I assign a value to that error message, right? From the body of my error, right? So error gets passed in to this method, handle errors. And if it's an array of errors, because sometimes you have multiple errors, then I'm going to append the errors together in my string, my error message string. If it's just a string and it's not an array of strings, then I'm just going to assign error message to the body. And this is typically what I use. You could even put this in a in its own, reusable module for you to use anywhere. And this has been pretty consistent for me overall, as long as I'm throwing aura handled exceptions anyway. So that's the nicest way to deal with errors, or exceptions rather, in Lightning Web Components, at least when you're dealing with Apex. So yeah, I would say definitely attempt to replicate this as much as you can. The other thing that I guess I want to point out is, it's not super important for this video, but normally what I do in controllers anyway is I don't put any of this logic in a controller, right? I have all of my logic actually in what's referred to as a service class. And if you don't know what a service class is, I got a video for that one too. I'll put it up above if I've still got enough links to put it up above, and I'll definitely put it in the description as well. But I normally put all 100% of the logic into a service class, and I would just call the specific service class method that I want, and I wrap it in a try catch block there. So for those of you that know what a service class is, chances are you're using it in the same way. I'm not going to go into all of that here, but I just wrap that method in a try, and then I catch anything that goes wrong, and I throw new aura handled exceptions based on whatever goes wrong. That way I can always manage, my error messaging out well. So for anybody out there that's wondering about that specific scenario, that is how I do it. I basically just, say this was calling out to a service class method, I just wrap it in a try catch and throw new or handled exceptions, because that is the way, in my mind anyway. Okay, so I think we've taken a look at all of the major Apex related stuff. How to handle it with triggers, how to handle exceptions with Lightning Web Components, the different granular exception types. I'm not going to go over each one, obviously, but I'll put a link in the description to each one of those, to the documentation where you can take a look at each one of those granular exception types. And we've kind of taken a little bit of a look at how you can catch errors in JavaScript, and then how you can handle those errors in the Apex to send back to it, so that it's a little bit of a cleaner transaction for you. The last two things that we will take a look at are custom exception handling in Apex, and then we'll take a look at exception handling in JavaScript, and like just pure JavaScript in your JavaScript controllers, and custom exception handling with JavaScript as well. So let's get to it. Okay, so the last Apex thing we will cover are custom exceptions, and I will say that the reasoning that Salesforce gives for why to create custom exceptions, that's not the right one, this is the right one, is a little bit misleading, because it says that the reason that you would create a custom exception is you can't throw built-in Apex exceptions, you can only catch them, but with custom exceptions you can throw and catch them. That's actually not true. And I even remember once in an interview somebody asking me this, and I told them this, and they were like, that's false, and pretty sure they weren't a fan of it. But let me show you what I mean before we get into the custom exceptions. This is the reason that people will state that they create custom exceptions, but the reality of the situation is I can throw an out-of-the-box exception whenever I want, DML exception, and say like chocolate sauce or something, which is a little bit ridiculous. But if I throw this, so I'm just going to save it, and I'll bring up my application again once it's saved, and if I hit generate error, it's going to run just fine and throw chocolate sauce. Alright, so the documentation is a little, like, I would say misleading, I suppose. Even if I got rid of this instead of throwing it right there, it wouldn't matter, just to be 100% clear, since I do still have that throw in there. Oh, if I can get the right screens up, maybe. And if I close this, I refresh this, and I generate it, you still get chocolate sauce. Right, I just have my extra string in there that says this is the handled exception. So despite what the documentation states, this is not true. You can throw built-in exceptions. The only one that you can't throw out of the box is exception like this. If you try to do this, the generic exception, I don't even think it'll save. Yeah, it'll say you can't construct it. But any of the other ones you can. So this is a little bit, deceiving. What I would say the primary reason that I create custom exceptions for is because I have a scenario that doesn't really fit into the out-of-the-box exceptions, right? So say there are errors that I want to display to the user, right? In the event that, say, maybe you've got some kind of opportunity set up and sales reps are able to give, I don't know, 15% up to 15% discounts, but anytime over that, you need to throw an error and tell them a bunch of things about it. Well, in those scenarios, there's no out-of-the-box or pre-built exception type that handles that. So I would create a new exception for that scenario and throw that exception. Because in my personal opinion, it's cleaner to build your own exceptions and throw your own exceptions like that, as opposed to, like outputting a string, which is what I see quite a bit, and we'll go over here in just a second. So whenever you want to throw an exception that's kind of custom, that doesn't fit into any of the out-of-the-box things like DML exceptions or external object exceptions or whatever else, what you will do is you'll create a new class. Now you can create a brand new class if you're going to use it a bunch of different places, or if it's just going to be used within one area of your application, like say a service or something, then you can create it in here. I'm going to create an inner class just for the sake of time, and we'll say public class cool exception. One thing that you do have to do here is make sure that your class ends with the word exception. If it doesn't, it will not work. It'll complain and tell you can't do that. And then you'll have it extend the exception type. And that's it. Nothing else is needed. You'll have cool exception here. You have it extend exception. And then now what I can do is up here, I can throw new cool exception in whatever theoretical scenario. So this opportunity is not cool enough. Now, you might be thinking to yourself right now, a thought that I had had many times before I started to do this, which is, hey Matt, why can't I just return a string, right? Maybe it doesn't really matter. Maybe I'm in a trigger and I'm just adding an error. Maybe I'm using a Lightning Web Component and I'm doing this. Maybe it's a completely different scenario. Why don't I just return a string that basically is my, string success message, right? Or whatever you want to call that. Why don't I just do that? The reason that I don't personally like to do this is because there's no consistency here, right? You don't ever know from one controller to the next what somebody's going to use for a success message. So you could say, you try this. Sorry, let me get rid of this here. You could say you try this, and if it was successful, you could say success and pass that back. Or if it was a failure, instead of throwing new or handled exceptions, you could say success message equals failure. And then you go back into your code and you process it. And that's even more common when we're dealing with these kind of custom exception scenarios. If I was in my code and I was looking to see, if an opportunity exceeded a 15% discount, then what I see very, very, very often in code is people do something like the success message where they send it back saying you can't do more than 15% or whatever else. And then over here, whether it's in your trigger or whether it's in an LWC, you have to custom process that stuff, right? You have to handle that exception and you have to handle it in a success area, right? Instead of in a failure, like a try-catch area. And that's confusing to the next developer that comes in for multiple reasons. Number one, when you do this string method, there is almost no consistency that I've seen, at least in code bases, when you go this route. Everybody does a different thing, or even the same person will do the same or different thing in different places, where they'll, say it'd be like 15% discount is the max. And you come back over here, and instead of handling in this catch block, what you'd end up doing is you'd get a successful return message because you'd never throw anything, and you just return success message, right? Like so. I think a lot of people have likely seen this, but hopefully I'm explaining this right. I'll just return it here and explain this a little bit to you. This, when you come, if you go this route, which is very common, what you'll see this argument that people say just use the string and return this string and blah 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 whatever else. Well, then you have to process this uniquely in every scenario. So it's going to come back as a result, right? A success. It's not going to come back as a failure and be caught. Instead, what you're going to have to do is say if result is not equal to success, then do whatever, right? Then do this. Then say error, this dot error message equals result, basically. And alternatively, if there were spanning statements like we kind of talked about before, there were multiple catches, you would have to say else if result equals 15% discount or whatever I said, then do this and this and this and blah 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 blah. And this is harder to deal with in your front end code, right? You've got a lot more going on here than you do if you just process you throw an exception and then you handle it. And then you can use this completely abstracted method here to handle the errors and not really have to deal with all these spanning scenarios. If you create the custom exception type and you actually use try catch blocks to throw errors instead of return specific messaging, it's a lot less code just in general. It's a lot less code overall, and there's a lot more consistency to that code. I hope you kind of get what I'm saying here. I maybe should build this example out a little more, but it's confusing, I think. You're handling your errors in your success instead of in an error catch block, which is frustrating. So, long story short, when you want to do custom exceptions, or when you need custom messaging that doesn't really fit in with an out-of-the-box, exception type, then I would create my own exception and throw that exception, because it's easier to throw that exception and have it handled like a typical exception than it is to do this string method that I see all too often and kind of span out and do whatever. So hopefully that helps there. Maybe. or I'm just rambling, one of the two. Next, we are going to go over JavaScript exception handling, because there are scenarios in JavaScript where you would want to handle it within the JavaScript in a try-catch block, and how to create custom exceptions in there as well. So let's get to it. All right, so we're finally here. Exceptions in JavaScript. What I will say about this is it's basically identical to what you do in Apex. So if you're already starting to feel comfortable with exceptions in Apex, this is going to be pretty easy to get through, I think. You're going to deal with it the same way, try catch finally, as before with those blocks. But the one thing that is quite a bit different is the amount of pre-built exception types. In Apex, you have quite a few built-in exception types, right? There's, tons of them that you can pull from. Whereas in JavaScript, it being a looser typed language and just in general not having to deal with Salesforce's many limits, you have quite a few less that are built in, right? You've got eval, range, reference, syntax, type, and URI exceptions. And I'm not going to go over what each one is. I mean, you can get a high-level overview right here if you just pause this video and check it out. And I'll put this link in the description because they have much more in-depth explanations of each one. What I will say is the ones that you typically get yourself into most often are reference, syntax, and type errors. The other three, while they do happen from time to time, are considerably less frequent, I would say. So what we're going to do is build just a simple try-catch together and see how it works. And then we'll create a custom exception type as well. So let's come back over here to the Lightning Web component we've been kind of working in, and looks pretty ugly at this point. And we'll just say JS exception example. And we'll do just the same thing we did in Apex. We'll create a try-catch block. But first we're going to create a variable called, I don't know, tacos, and not declare it. And then in the try, we're going to say if tacos is less than or equal to 1, then tacos equals tacos, which is going to confuse our code because tacos hasn't even been declared. It has not been given a type at all, right? We haven't said it's equal to 1 or a string or an array or something. So this is going to fail. And then we'll create a catch where we catch our error. And we'll say this dot error message equals error, just like so. And you can also, just like in Apex and like we discussed before, you can create a finally block if you'd like something to happen after you've caught your error. You know, whether that's you bail on things or you turn off a modal or turn on a modal or set a true false value, who knows. You can place that in the finally block so that it gets done regardless of success or error, right? Okay, so let's do one more thing here. I'm going to remove this Apex exception handling thing, and we're just going to call this .js exception example and see what happens. Hopefully we get an error message that displays, but I guess we'll find out. Actually, just to be 100% sure, I'm going to just completely remove the declaration of tacos too, because then we should definitely get an error. Okay, let me save that. Let's go back here to this exception handling example component. I'm going to refresh this, and then we'll hit generate error, and hopefully something pops up. And it does. We get a reference error and says tacos is not defined, which is great. So we tried this. It didn't work because we have a reference error. We haven't defined tacos anywhere. And then we caught it and set it to our error message, and we're good to go. It displayed. So as you can see, you're basically setting things up in a very, very, very similar way to what you're doing in Apex. There's almost nothing different, but, you know, just to be comfortable with it. And obviously the out-of-the-box or pre-built-in exception types are quite a bit different than Apex's are. So next, let's go over how to create a custom exception in JavaScript, which I think you'll find is also very similar to Apex. So let's check it out. All right, so custom exceptions or custom errors in JavaScript are built very similar to those that you create in Apex. But there is one thing that I want to bring up before we get into creating a custom exception class or a custom error class in JavaScript. For some reason, number one, they're called custom errors instead of custom exceptions, but we'll see that in just a second. The second thing is JavaScript, being the loosely typed language that it is, has the ability for you to just throw like literally anything. You could say throw hi there, and it would throw this as an error, and it would show itself up here, or you could say throw 18, and it would do the same thing. So just as an example, if I did throw hi there, and I came back over here, and reloaded this, it should throw hi there, right? So it threw that as an error, and we caught it, and we added it to the error message. Now, I do see this from time to time, although I don't see it as often because in Salesforce it seems that almost nobody does try-catch in their actual JavaScript or exception handling at all in their actual JavaScript, in my experience anyway. But this really probably shouldn't be done. And it shouldn't be done for the same kind of reason that I was mentioning, that returning a string from a method, from an Apex method with, your success or failure message shouldn't be done. There is no consistency here. There's no potential for reuse here, right? I can't just throw this and expect all the other developers to know that I can throw this, or I have been consistently throwing this error in my other Lightning Web Components, right? There5 no consistency here. There's no way to be, to really reuse this in a simple way. And there's it's just confusing. So I personally prefer to not do this, and instead create reusable modules that I can use for my exceptions. And what I mean by that is, just like in Apex, where we can create our own exception, right? We create a class that extends the exception type, and we can throw our custom exception. You can do the same thing in JavaScript, but with modules. So I could create that module in different ways. I could, just like in Apex, where I created my, that's definitely in the wrong class, where I created my class within this class, my exception class. I could, in JavaScript, create a new JavaScript file, and I could call it, so this is within the same Lightning Web Component, but you have to create your own new JavaScript module within it. We'd say custom exception, or really JavaScript calls these errors, not exceptions. So I'm going to go with custom error, and we would just keep it real nice and simple, just like we did with Apex, and say extends error instead of exception. And now we've got our own custom error that we can throw and we can reuse different places, right? And the way that we would leverage this in our JavaScript is we come back over here, we would import custom error from custom error, right? And if you don't know what JavaScript modules are and how to import them or anything like this, I've got a video for that one too, so I'll put it in the description. You guys can check it out, and hopefully this will not be super confusing to you. But at that point, you've now got your custom error class, and you can say in the scenarios where your custom error is relevant, just like with the opportunity stuff, say there was a scenario where you could potentially go over 15%, an over a 15% discount just in the UI. Well, you could throw that new error using this as well, and you could reuse that custom error messaging everywhere, right? You could reuse that custom throw or error class everywhere. So now I could just say throw new custom error and say you've got an error, bruh. Of course, I need to escape this. There we go. And if we save this, we've now got this custom error. And if we come back to JavaScript or our component here, refresh it, as long as I didn't do anything wrong, you've got an error, bruh. And we can reuse this a lot of different places, which is nice, right? Yeah, so there's at least a little bit of consistency of the error type that you're throwing, how you're catching it, all that kind of stuff. And you could create this as its own standalone module too to make it super clear to everybody in your org what the different exception types are that have been built and how they can be reused. So you could say, you know, custom error org wide or something. And it's not going to let me do this because I capitalized the first letter here. And I'll hit OK. And we can delete the HTML file because we won't need this. We can just say export class extends error. And then if we came back over to our exception handling example, we could import it instead. Actually, we can just leave it as it was and make this marginally easier. Just say import custom org wide from custom error org wide. And just so you're a little clear about these imports, if you create a new class or whatever that you're importing into a Lightning Web Component and it exists within the same folder, the same Lightning Web Component folder like the first one did, then you do that /. If it's a component outside of your current Lightning Web Component folder, you do C/. And now we'll just take this custom error org wide, drop it down here, hit save. And after that saves, we'll come back over here, refresh this yet again, and hit generate error, and we've got an error, bruh. So everything worked as anticipated. Yeah, I think that ought to do it. Hopefully, everything that I presented to you here today was at least mostly clear as to why you might choose one thing or over another, why you might do, you know, more specific exception handling over non-specific exception handling, why you'd create your own types as opposed to just returning strings or throwing strings or whatever else. But yeah, I mean, if you guys have any questions, definitely leave them in the comments. I will do my best to answer them. I know I'm not always perfect. Sometimes I miss comments. Sometimes I just don't have time. But I do my best. I promise I will. So if you've got any questions, definitely leave them below. Yeah, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like it. Subscribe if you want to be entered into a monthly contest to win free certs and consulting time with me. To ask me questions about your org and whatever else, and a free month in the Discord server where you can ask me questions all month long. Whatever you need help with, I will be there to help you with it. Yeah, guys, that ought to do it for this one. I hope I've covered everything. I hope I have. I hope this has helped. So, anyway, I'll see you guys next time.